Hello everyone, TJ here yet again for another episode of 99% Sure. Our last episode of the season as it turns out, and if you haven't seen the others, we encourage you to go back and check them out. Today we're going to talk about a contradiction that we find in Old North's history. The fact that a symbol of freedom like Old North can also have numerous direct and indirect connections to slavery. In particular, we'll examine a commodity called logwood, a crop dependent on enslaved labor in the Atlantic maritime trade, which can tell us quite a bit about the world of the 1700s. Logwood had a big impact on the construction and wealth of Old North, and we'll learn how decisions made even 300 years ago still reverberate today. In 1727, Old North was offered a sizable donation, both in physical and monetary terms, from a group of British loggers working in what was called the Bay of Honduras, or modern-day Belize, not confusingly enough where modern-day Honduras is located. The gift was over 100 tons of a valuable material called logwood, and the offer was for the church to sell this material to raise money. Old North, still brand new and in the early stages of trying to establish itself, gladly accepted. And while on the surface this seems like a very generous gift, becoming involved in the logwood trade associated Old North with a major ethical problem, one that they didn't grapple with back then, but one that existed all the same. So what was this unique commodity? Well, logwood is a fairly short, gnarled tree primarily found in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's relatively obscure today, but it was highly valuable in the colonial era for its use in making dyes. The heartwood could be treated to create a range of stable colors which were otherwise difficult to make. The demand was really high in Europe. From the late 1600s up until the mid to late 1700s, thousands of tons of this stuff was being cut and shipped out of the region virtually every year. Because the majority of logwood was cut in the Bay of Honduras, these mostly British loggers were usually referred to as baymen. But increasingly over time, these white baymen were not the ones doing the logging. They relied primarily on enslaved black people and likely a number of enslaved indigenous people as well. The baymen used enslaved labor in every step of the process of logwood cutting, scouting for logwood locations, felling the trees, removing the bark, cutting it into shorter lengths, thus the term logwood, transporting it via river to the coast, and literally hauling it from location to location. Enslaved people also would have assisted with the auxiliary tasks of daily life in this region, hunting, cooking, and everything else that came with these highly mobile camps. In short, the logwood trade completely relied on enslaved labor. The work was extremely exhausting in intense heat. Disease and malnutrition were rampant, with frequent flooding adding to the misery. It's hard to tell based on the scattered records from this time period, but it seems that death rates in the region were high. For a number of reasons, then, the population in total remained small. Throughout much of the 1700s, the population of free and enslaved logwood cutters hovered around 1,000 people at most, often much less. That means those few hundred individuals were responsible for cutting and transporting those thousands of tons of logwood in any given year that I mentioned earlier. The work was always backbreaking, but when prices began to drop in the mid-1700s, the demands and output only increased. In addition to the brutal work involved with this system of slavery, the logwood trade was also the source of frequent violence, the torture of enslaved people, and the kidnapping of women for the predominantly male settlement. This also says nothing of the long history of continuous inter-European warfare that caught indigenous and black people in the crossfire. In many ways, the system of slavery was different in this region, but I hasten to add that different does not mean better. It was just as brutal, just as cruel as slavery elsewhere in the British Empire. That's all a huge topic in and of itself, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll recenter on the intersection of the logwood trade and Old North and why that is significant. New England merchants were among the leading middlemen of this trade, which started with felling logwood in the Bay of Honduras and ultimately ended in European dye works. Logwood is one example of many of just how interconnected the Atlantic world was back then. Given New England's prominent role in this interconnected trade, as well as Old North's connection to the sea, the congregation had a lot of merchants and sea captains among its members, I would wager that some congregants, at least, had already worked in the trade, but either way, Old North became inseparably linked after that 1727 donation. And the church was a willing partner in this arrangement. As a thank you, the church dedicated a special double pew that was reserved solely for any visiting baymen with the finest decorations and prayer books. This pew is viewable in the church today. One of the baymen, Captain William Richardson, was later elected to the vestry, partially in hope that he could use his connections to secure more logwood donations. Gifts from the baymen continued at least until the 1740s, but the most impactful of all were in the late 1730s, when a series of shipments of logwood were sold and used to pay for finishing construction of the steeple, which was completed in 1740, the very steeple later used to help launch the War for Independence. The building reflects the larger contradiction of the American Revolution, a symbol of freedom supported by the proceeds of slavery. That may be uncomfortable to hear, but it is important to hear. The steeple was hardly the only connection to slavery for the church, the city of Boston, or, of course, for the colony as a whole. For Old North's part, enslavers were even among the congregation itself at the time, including the minister. In addition, logwood also wasn't unique for its entanglement with brutal labor practices. Virtually every commodity, trade, and individual had ties to slavery back then. That isn't brought up to excuse Old North's decisions at the time, but highlights all the ways that slavery underpinned everything. Of course, our site finds these ties to enslaved labor troubling, to say the least. As unsurprising as connections such as these are, truth can often be painful and difficult. We have begun the process of uncovering more of these truths and honestly examining our institution's role in systemic racism. Rather than hiding these uncomfortable facts, we need to face them and understand them, because events and actions don't exist in isolation. Understanding Old North's ties to the logwood trade doesn't negate the inspirational stories, and sharing the complexity doesn't absolve us from past sins either. Instead, accepting the complexity and the contradictions in our own past gives us the directive to move forward into a more equitable future. Frankly, this 5-minute video on logwood is just the beginning. It's merely one example of how slavery underpinned colonial society. Logwood is a case study of the fact that slavery was so omnipresent in American communities and economies that even those who were not themselves enslavers could still profit off of it. This one commodity that no one's even really heard of anymore is directly linked to Old North's steeple, the same steeple that reflects a part of the American identity, an identity intertwined with slavery, but a symbol that can represent freedom to many people. Learning about the pervasiveness and injustices of slavery helps us better process current events. The repercussions of slavery and systemic racism in our country exist today. These issues weren't solved by the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment or even the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Instead, we face an ongoing and significant challenge to undo the centuries of oppression Black Americans have endured. I want to end this first season with something proactive. You know that we talk about active citizenship all the time here at Old North, so I want to encourage you to consider how the choices we make now as a society have wider implications in the world, and to consider how the seeds of the present can be found in the past. So what do the actions we take now mean for the future? We can't change or hide from the past, but we can and must do better now. We as individuals, as institutions, and as a nation need to make decisions today that live up to the values we promote. Thank you again for joining us for our first season of 99% Sure. We hope to return soon for more videos on all the different aspects of Old North's history. If you subscribe to Old North's channel, you'll be alerted when more episodes come out. We would love to hear from you in the comments below or on Old North's social media or blog. We do keep an eye out for any questions you have, and we'll do our best to answer them. And thanks again for joining us.